unless they develop new mines. But for now, I think that supply chain is largely Chinese dominated. So this could be a potential point of leverage that the Chinese have over the Americans if it gets to a point of where it looks like it's going, where they're going to start playing those cards. So I think there is precedent for this, and it's something that I know that Pentagon officials are worried about, but I'm just surprised we haven't seen more action to do something about it.
Could we ask you all to state whether you think the Pentagon is going to be doing more in Africa over the next 5 years, regardless of what happens in November, or less? I mean, so the last 4 years we've seen the trend line has been to pull back, at least and certainly to announce pulling back from places like Niger and so on, less interested in any direct involvement in Somalia and so forth. The only big security dispute the US has got involved in is the dam with Egypt and Ethiopia. I wondered what your take on that, each of you, is whether we're going to see more US military involvement or less.
I think it's a question of sorting out what should the U.S. military be doing in Africa. And are we talking about basing? Are we talking about troops on the ground, or a DoD, Pentagon, AFRICOM that deploys troops and advisors, in a temporary status? And I think that even in the previous administration, there has been some questions around both the efficacy of some of the military operations that we've done in the region, as well as does it connect to U.S. national security interests? And I think we would have to have a whole episode to debate that. But my view is that what the current proposal on the table, as we understand it, largely to withdraw troops from West Africa, I think is misguided, in part because I do think that it is a terrible signal to our partners, both in the region and Europe, who do value what we do, and maybe that's in contrast to other regions. I think that it provides an opening for less China, but more Russia, who likes to walk in and say, the US is gone, we can proffer these items to you. I think that an ounce of prevention is worth a lot more than a cure, and the U.S. ends up spending a tremendous amount of money around supporting peacekeeping missions and humanitarian missions. But what we have to think about is, what does the military provide beyond just whack-a-mole with terrorists? And if you look at the COVID crisis, tremendous contributions from the U.S. military on COVID in Africa, and certainly in Ebola. They're the ones building hospitals. They're the ones that are delivering EDA, excess defense articles, and ambulances and ventilators across the continent. I think the U.S. military, as we've talked about before, with a government, even in any administration, that the president only goes to a certain amount of countries, the AFRICOM combatant commander ends up being the most senior person that African heads of state meets with outside of the ambassador. So I hope that what we're talking about will be, one, what does our posture look like? But more importantly, what are we doing? And how does the military fit into a more comprehensive strategy and partnership? And some of those most important missions are not going to be CT.
But it's interesting because what Judd is saying is, and what we saw last year in the debate in Washington with the misalignment between the political class and the professional class, it really goes back to this lack of a vision where we're just not clear. And I think that's going to be the very big problem, is what are we actually doing? That being said as well, I think U.S. Pentagon resources are going to be stretched very thin. They're being redeployed out here into Asia. We have multiple battle groups now in the South China Sea. That's going to put a demand on resources to confront China in this part of the world. So again, without a vision, the military is going to be adrift, and the fact that the political class and the professional class in so many different ways are not seeing the same thing. That's a problem that I think will continue for quite some time.
I just think it's ridiculous when they talk about how the some thousand troops in West Africa are going to make a huge difference in the Pacific theater versus what they can do in West Africa. And so I think it's just throwing bodies at a problem set and not thinking very strategically about the sort of yields that one gets in different theaters and arenas.
We've got time for one more question. We've actually been in touch with the White House and the Biden campaign, and they have agreed. It doesn't matter who gets into power, but they've agreed. It's probably the only thing they agree on now, that you three each get one policy recommendation that they're definitely going to do. So for the next president, you'll get to have one policy recommendation that definitely is going to happen. Aubrey, why don't you go first?
Of course, I would continue with this commercial push for sure. For me, it's where I think American business needs to go. But during this COVID time, and I think the Biden administration will be taking over in a period that will also be defined by COVID in the short term, I would say a big educational initiative would be very interesting for African markets, where we could have a lot of edutech, where you could have partnerships between American universities, and somehow trying to reach the next generation of African business and political leaders, so that there can be partnerships. Because, for example, I benefit every day in doing business in the region from a significant cadre of brilliant African entrepreneurs who've studied in the US or have ties in the US. And I cannot imagine doing business without that kind of soft landing of shared culture, shared values, and shared interests. So for me, I think that would be a great boon to the US, not only in the near term, but in the next 20, 25 years.
Okay, I'm going to cheat a little bit, Nick. So in terms of vision, just to sort of dovetail on what we've been talking about, obviously, I think that we have to have a more affirmative vision and a cohesive vision. And part of that really has to be that what happens in Africa does change the way in which the world works. And some of the biggest challenges that we will face globally will need to have African voices, particularly around climate change. And I still think that Africa is an afterthought in multilateral forums. And I think that's one way to sort of think through its seriousness, implication, significance. But if I'm going to talk about a specific program, and Aubrey kind of set me up nicely to talk about one of my passions, which is urban. The future of Africa is urban. Actually, the present of Africa is urban. And we are just underinvested in thinking about making African cities more open for trade, investment, to think about the planning around how these cities operate. We don't think a lot about the security implications or even the public health implications, which, if you want to take a page from COVID, look at where it is right now, most rampant. It's in cities. So the US government continues to envision Africa as rural. And I think that is, for many countries, already past. And by the end of this decade, will certainly be over in terms of majority urban continent.
I'm just relieved that Aubrey and Judd did not take my policy recommendation, because I'm hoping that you're going to get me paid for this, okay? Because this is a good one. They got to show up. You got to get there. Xi Jinping just has held, leadership summits virtually. Wang Yi, the Chinese foreign minister, just convened an Arab foreign ministers summit. They're showing up. They're there. They're at the ministerial level. We got to get, and Pompeo has got to stop talking about China and stop talking about things that Africans don't care about. And it undermines, it's patronizing. A couple times I've asked Judd, I'm like, who is Pompeo talking to? And, and again, the messaging is all wrong, but most important, American stakeholders at the ministerial level and above, the cabinet secretaries and above, have to show up. And they have to start listening. Nigerians actually have lessons for us on how to manage infectious and contagious diseases. They have been dealing with this for a lot longer than we have. And so we are so accustomed to telling people what to do, and we don't listen. And I think there's a lot that we can do in listening to various African stakeholders, but that can't be done unless we're showing up and building those personal relationships. And I think that is job one right there. Nothing else is really possible until you actually start meeting with people and talking with them. And yes, it can be done via Zoom meetings. And because the Chinese are doing it, the Europeans are doing it, I follow the news very closely, and I've yet to see a cabinet secretary, as far as I know, you guys might correct me, who has convened a multinational summit in Africa in the past 6 months. It just, and to me, it's like, without showing up, nothing else is really possible. So showing up.
Thanks so much, guys. We're going to forward all of those ideas to both campaigns.
And that brings us to the end of this week's podcast. It's also our last podcast for the season, but we will be back in September with a new season of conversations, debates, and interviews with the top newsmakers in Africa. In the meantime, we'll be playing some of the greatest hits in the Africa Reports podcast archive. So have a great August, and we look forward to being back in touch with you again in September.